From the moment Russ Kloskin entered the world, chaos was already waiting for him. His childhood, if it could be called that, was shaped by instability, fear, and a home that rarely felt like a safe place. Violence was not something he discovered later in life. It surrounded him. It molded him. And by the time most children were learning multiplication tables, Kloskin was learning how to survive in a world where fists, rage, and broken promises filled the air like a constant storm. In the background of his earliest memories were adults incapable of offering security, caught in cycles of addiction, anger, or neglect. A child growing up in that environment learns quickly that no one is coming to save them. If anything, the world only hits harder. By age 12, the consequences of that upbringing collided with the law. He entered the juvenile justice system while still barely old enough to understand the long-term consequences of his actions. But what he did understand, what he had been trained to understand, was that strength meant survival. In juvenile detention, young Russ encountered other kids just like him, angry, hardened, and already convinced the world had turned its back on them. For someone who never knew stability, even the harsh structure of the justice system felt strangely predictable. There were rules, there were consequences. But most important, there were hierarchies, social ladders he instinctively knew how to climb. When he was 15, still technically a boy but already shaped into a survivor, he was sentenced to adult prison. It was a move that would permanently alter the course of his life. The walls were higher, the men more dangerous, and the stakes far beyond anything he had experienced in the juvenile system. Adult prison was a world built on power, fear, and violence, where the difference between life and death could depend on the alliances you formed your first week inside. There was no space for hesitation, no space for weakness, and certainly no room for a teenage boy who still hoped someone might rescue him from this path. Survival meant adapting fast. Inside those walls, Russ encountered the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, known simply as the ABT. At first, he watched them from a distance. They moved like a unified force, disciplined, organized, feared. While other inmates were isolated and drifting, ABT members operated like a military unit. They offered protection. They offered identity. They offered belonging. For a kid who had spent his whole life being thrown away, that sense of belonging was intoxicating. The gang filled a void he had never been able to name. In the absence of a family, the Brotherhood became one. Joining the ABT wasn't something he stumbled into. It was a deliberate choice. For the first time, he felt the weight of a system that not only accepted his anger, but valued it. Violence, which had been a survival tool in his childhood, now served as a currency. The more willing he was to fight, enforce, and obey, the more useful he became. And usefulness, in a place like that, meant protection. The ABT did not accept weakness, but it rewarded loyalty. It rewarded brutality. It rewarded those willing to become instruments of the gang's authority. Russ quickly realized he excelled in that role. As months turned into years, his reputation grew. He learned how to read the rhythms of prison politics, how to command fear, and how to impose discipline with cold precision. The gang took notice. He was young, but he exhibited leadership qualities that made him a natural candidate for advancement. He followed orders without question. He executed tasks with efficiency, and he carried a commitment to the Brotherhood that others respected. Promotion inside the ABT rarely came through words. It came through acts, and Russ was willing to commit the acts. By the late 1990s, the teenager who had once entered prison Scared and alone, had evolved into one of the most feared men on the inside. His rise was not accidental. It was forged in the fires of violence, sharpened through years of doing whatever was required to survive and to ascend. His reputation was carved into the memories of other inmates, whispered through cell blocks and rec yards. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas had dozens of leaders over the years, but few rose as quickly or as brutally as Russ Kloskin. Eventually, he reached the top. He became president of the ABT, an apex position within one of America's most violent white supremacist prison gangs. With that title came influence, power, respect, but also responsibility. The responsibility to keep the gang strong, to maintain order, and to enforce its rules without hesitation. For someone who had been shaped by violence since childhood, leading a criminal empire inside prison seemed almost like destiny. But destiny is rarely gentle, and for Russ Kloskin, the path that brought him power was also the path that would nearly destroy him. Because every act of violence carries a shadow. Every decision made in the name of the gang adds another layer to the darkness. And for Russ, the darkest chapter was still waiting, one that would change the course of his life forever. By the time Russ Kloskin solidified his role as president of the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, he had become a man fully shaped by the world that raised him. Prison had been both his battleground and his classroom. Now, it became his kingdom. As leader of the ABT, Kloskin operated at the highest levels of prison power. Every day meant making decisions that carried weight, decisions about who lived, who suffered, who was trusted, and who had crossed the line. Inside the walls, reputation was currency, and Russ's reputation was ironclad. Even officers knew his name, his reach, his capacity for violence. He wasn't simply another inmate. He was a commander in a silent war fought in hallways, chow lines, and shadowed corners of the yard. The operations of the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas were built on extremes. Extreme loyalty, extreme discipline, extreme retribution. The gang had its own laws that superseded everything else. To break those laws meant punishment that was swift and unforgiving. As president, Russ enforced those laws with a level of ruthlessness that resonated throughout the system. He wasn't a man acting alone. He was the embodiment of a machine. And within that machine, violence wasn't an option, it was an obligation. The ABT managed everything from contraband distribution to taxation of inmates, and their influence extended well beyond the walls of a single unit. Orders moved like coded messages between cells, carried by word of mouth, hidden notes, and long-standing networks that had outsmarted the system for years. For Russ, issuing those orders became second nature. The line between the man he was and the gang he served blurred until they were indistinguishable. Every choice was filtered through ABT needs. Every conflict became a test of dominance. His leadership depended on being both feared and respected. In a world where one moment of hesitation could spiral into chaos, he delivered neither weakness nor mercy. But power in prison is never absolute. With authority came tensions, both external and internal. The ABT had enemies, rival gangs that competed for territory, influence, and survival. Every alliance, every rivalry, every unspoken tension demanded constant vigilance. Violence was not random, it was strategic. For Russ, escalating brutality was simply part of the job. He was not acting out of impulse, but out of duty to the gang's survival. And in the 1990s, that duty would push him and his associates toward darker and more catastrophic acts. The year that marked the beginning of the end was 1996. Within the confines of prison life, conflicts rarely simmered for long. Tensions between inmates could erupt violently, and the ABT leadership expected Kloskin to handle such matters with precision. But one incident would eclipse all others. In 1996, Russ became involved in the hanging of another man, an act that was both violent and symbolic, a statement meant to reinforce the ABT's authority and send a message about the consequences of defiance. Though the details surrounding the killing were grim, what mattered most in the aftermath was what it triggered. The prison system reacted swiftly, investigations followed, and authorities zeroed in on Kloskin and those who had acted alongside him. Inside a prison environment already on edge, the administration could not ignore the brutal display of gang power. The response was decisive. Kloskin and his accomplices were removed from the general population and placed into solitary confinement. For a man who had built his life on control of people, control of spaces, control of outcomes, the move to solitary was the most severe blow he had ever faced. One moment, he commanded a network of men across multiple units. The next, he was alone in a concrete cell the size of a bathroom, stripped of the influence he had spent years cultivating. The isolation was designed to break gang leaders, to disrupt communication, to eliminate the possibility of orchestrating violence from within. And in Russ's case, it worked, but not in the way authorities expected. At first, the transition was unbearable. Solitary confinement is not merely a punishment. It is an experience that challenges the mind at its deepest levels. Hours bled into days, days into months. The silence became a weight pressing on his chest. The absence of voices from the ABT, a gang that had once defined him, left him unmoored. Men who lived in solitary long enough often had two paths. They hardened into something even more dangerous, or they began to unravel. Russ felt himself pulled in both directions. The longer he remained in isolation, the more his past played on loop in his mind. The violence he had committed, the people he had hurt, the choices that led him to this moment. The stark walls of solitary confinement offered no distractions, no escape, no way to avoid one's own conscience. That was the point. Authorities had removed him from leadership, but in doing so, they placed him on a collision course with himself. What began as punishment would soon become transformation. But before redemption could take root, Russ had to confront the darkest truth of all, that he had not only been shaped by violence, he had become an architect of it. And in a place where time stood still and silence echoed endlessly, he had no choice but to face the man he had become. The first cracks in his old identity began to form, yet no one, not even Russ himself, could have predicted what those cracks would eventually reveal. Solitary confinement is designed to strip a person down, to peel away the layers of identity, ego, and routine until only the bare, unfiltered mind remains. For Russ Kloskin, the transition from prison leader to isolated inmate was like being dropped into a void. The cell was small, barely large enough to pace in. The walls were concrete, painted in a dull, lifeless color that swallowed any sense of warmth. The lights buzzed faintly overhead. The door shut with a finality that seemed to echo his entire life story. He had built power inside prison, but inside this cell, that power counted for nothing. In solitary, everyone was equal. Every man faced only himself. The days came slowly at first. Hours dragged. There was no one to talk to, no orders to give, no gang politics to navigate. The structure that had once defined Russ, leadership, violence, control, had been removed in an instant. He woke to silence, moved through silence, and fell asleep to silence. Food was slid through a slot. Recreation meant pacing alone in a slightly larger cage for an hour. The overwhelming emptiness felt like a kind of drowning, a suffocation without air or water. Men reacted differently to this environment. Some grew more violent, some fell apart, some disappeared into their minds. Russ felt himself hovering in a dangerous middle ground. But isolation doesn't just weaken the body. It exposes the soul. Memories that Russ had spent years suppressing began to rise like ghosts. The people he had hurt. The men he had ordered to be beaten. The man who died in 1996. Voices returned. Faces returned. The weight of years of violence he once committed without hesitation, now pressed down on him with suffocating force. Alone, with nothing to distract him, he was forced to confront a truth he had long avoided. His life had become a monument to destruction. Somewhere in the vast emptiness of solitary, Russ began to ask the questions he had never dared to ask before. Who am I without the gang? What am I without violence? What is left when the identity I built no longer exists? These questions circled in his mind like vultures, and for the first time since he was a child, he couldn't escape them. It was in this mental and emotional freefall that something unexpected happened. In the early years of his confinement, Russ asked for reading material simply to pass the time. Among the books sent to his cell was a Bible. At first, it was just another object, something to flip through when the boredom became unbearable. But the more he read, the more it began to shift something inside him. The verses spoke of forgiveness, redemption, transformation, ideas that had been foreign to his entire existence. The words didn't just fill time. They struck at the core of the man he had become. The transformation didn't happen in a single moment. It wasn't a dramatic revelation or a sudden spiritual jolt. It happened slowly, quietly, like a seed sprouting in a place where nothing was supposed to grow. Russ began to pray. Not because he knew how, but because he had nowhere else to turn. He prayed for clarity, for forgiveness, for a way forward. He prayed because, for the first time in his life, he understood the enormity of the damage he had caused. And in that understanding, something broke open inside him. Something softened. Something changed. By the year 2000, 4 years into solitary, Russ reached a turning point. The gang identity that had once been his armor began to fall away. The ABT, which once gave him belonging, now felt like a prison inside a prison. He realized he could no longer be the man he once was. And in a decision that could have gotten him killed in another context, he officially stepped away from the Aryan Brotherhood. Renouncing a gang like the ABT is not a symbolic gesture. It is the severing of ties that once defined your entire existence. It is an act that requires courage, conviction, and the acceptance that you may lose everything, even your life. But Russ wasn't turning toward nothing. He was turning toward something entirely new: faith. His conversion to Christianity reshaped the axis of his life. He devoured books on theology and philosophy, seeking to understand the world through a lens he had never been offered as a child or a young man. The same determination that once made him a feared gang leader now fueled his pursuit of knowledge. Over the next several years, still confined to solitary, he earned a bachelor's degree in ministry, then a master's degree in theology, and eventually a PhD. It was a staggering transformation, one that prison officials could hardly believe. Education became the architecture of his new identity. Every page he read, every assignment he completed, every prayer he whispered in the quiet of his cell, built a version of himself that had never existed before. He found strength not in violence, but in humility, not in power, but in purpose. He learned to see people, guards, inmates, victims, as human rather than pawns in a system of dominance. The man who once operated through fear now sought to live through compassion. Solitary confinement had begun as a punishment, a place meant to break him. Instead, it became the crucible of his rebirth. 7 years after entering that cell, Russ emerged as someone transformed. The darkness that had defined his life had not disappeared, but it had been confronted and reshaped. He had walked through the depths of his own mind and found something worth holding on to: faith, hope, and the possibility of redemption. Little did he know that upon release, the real test would begin. Freedom, after decades behind bars, would be its own kind of battleground, one where he would need every lesson he had learned in that small, silent cell. When Russ Kloskin finally stepped out of prison in 2013, it felt less like walking into freedom and more like entering a world he had never known. 35 years in and out of the system, most of them behind razor wire, changes a person. The outside world moves faster, louder, and without apology. The buildings were different. The language had shifted. Technology had advanced beyond anything he had ever touched. Even the way people communicated, their pace, their expectations, their fears, felt alien. Russ walked out with a small bag of belongings and a lifetime of memories he wished he could forget. But what he carried most was something invisible: the weight of redemption. Adjusting to life after prison is never simple. For Russ, it meant learning how to live without the rigid structure that had governed his every move for decades. There was no count time, no yard schedule, no tier to control, no gang hierarchy to maintain. He had to relearn basic things: how to use a phone, how to navigate a store, how to trust people who weren't part of a criminal world. There were moments of confusion, moments of fear, and moments when the past felt too heavy to overcome. But he reminded himself over and over, he had survived the darkest place a man could go. Everything else was manageable. Faith became his compass. The spiritual transformation he experienced in solitary confinement had not faded with time. If anything, it had grown stronger. Russ realized quickly that if he wanted to stay free, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually, he needed to anchor himself in purpose. The world outside didn't need another ex-con. It needed someone who could turn his story into something that mattered. And that realization moved him toward a path he never could have imagined in his earlier years: helping others who were walking out of the same darkness he had escaped. By 2017, Russ became a reentry specialist with Prison Fellowship, one of the largest prison reform and reentry organizations in the United States. The role suited him in a way that nothing else ever had. He understood incarceration not academically, not from a distance, but from the inside, from the pain of a broken childhood, from the violence of gang life, from years spent in isolation trying to rebuild a shattered identity. When he sat across from someone newly released from prison, he didn't speak as a counselor looking down from a safe distance. He spoke as someone who had been there, someone who had lived every chapter of the story they were trying to rewrite. His job was more than just helping with paperwork or pointing people toward employment resources. Russ listened. He guided, he challenged, he reminded people that they were more than their worst mistakes, and most importantly, he showed them by example that transformation was possible, even for those who believed they were too far gone. When men in halfway houses or support programs learned who he used to be, president of the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, they often expected him to still carry the hardness, the cold leadership, the intimidation. But what they found instead was a soft-spoken man whose greatest strength now came from humility. Russ began sharing his story publicly, not out of pride, but out of necessity. He spoke in prisons, churches, community groups, recovery programs, anywhere people needed to hear that redemption was possible. His testimony wasn't sanitized. He didn't shy away from the violence of his past or the shame he carried from the lives he had damaged. But he spoke with a clarity and sincerity that few could match. Prisoners who once believed they had no future listened to him with a kind of reverence. If a man who had led one of the most violent prison gangs in the country could walk away from that life, find faith, earn degrees, and build a new path, then maybe they could too. Oh, what set Russ apart wasn't just his story. It was his ability to translate years of destruction into a blueprint for hope. He spoke openly about accountability, about the cost of violence, about the internal work required to rise above trauma. He understood that redemption wasn't a moment, it was a lifelong process, a daily decision to choose something different from the man he used to be. And it was this understanding that shaped every conversation he had with the people he served. Over time, Russ became more than a mentor. He became a bridge, someone who stood between two worlds, the one he had come from and the one he was helping others step into. He could speak the language of both. He could understand the fear of walking out of prison with nothing. And he could guide people toward the tools they needed to rebuild, because he had used those same tools to rebuild himself. His transformation challenged stereotypes. It challenged assumptions about who could change, about who deserved a second chance. The public often views prison gang members as irredeemable, as permanently dangerous. Russ's life proved otherwise. He didn't pretend the past didn't exist. Instead, he used it as fuel for something greater, as evidence that even the most entrenched life paths could be rewritten. The more lives he touched, the more his own life took on new meaning. He realized that the years he once considered wasted were now the very reason he could help others so effectively. Every scar, every lesson, every moment spent in solitude had equipped him for a purpose far larger than the gang leadership he once embraced. Today, Russ Kloskin remains committed to that mission. He continues working with formerly incarcerated individuals, offering guidance, hope, and a story that defies the narrative of permanent failure. He has become a living testament to transformation, not through denial of the past, but through the courage to confront it. Russ's journey from an abused child to a prison gang leader, from solitary confinement to spiritual awakening, from incarceration to mentorship, stands as one of the most dramatic arcs a human life can hold. His story reminds us that even in the darkest environments, seeds of change can take root. And when nurtured, they can grow into something capable of healing not just the individual, but everyone they touch. In the end, Russ Kloskin's legacy is not the violence he once commanded, but the hope he now offers. His life is proof that redemption is not only possible, it can become the most powerful chapter of all.